Hello everyone and welcome back to the Sojourning Writer. Today we're going to go into part 2 of our Guns, Germs, and Steel overview of world building. We're going to be building off of what we learned about on Tuesday and trying to figure out how we can impart different characters and different races into our world so that we can have a more cohesive backstory. Now, one of the things that I'm going to be talking about here is actually to have variations or have different races that are going to be present in this world that we're trying to build. I believe that if you have more than one race at play, this allows us to have different perspectives on the interactions that we have. One of the things that we're also going to touch on early is whether or not our worlds are going to be magic based, whether they're going to have a creation story, if that creation story, depending on how influenced the world is going to be. So if you have a creation story and it's a pretty early on where you have a deity or deities creating the world, this allows you to have a head start in how things are going to play out. Now, it's completely up to you how you actually want your background for your world to be. I'm just going to be going over some ideas. What you want to keep in mind is how this is going to be affecting your story, and specifically how this is going to be affecting your protagonist, or if you have multiple protagonists. Now, that's going to be the ultimate goal for everything that we do here. It's always about advancing the plot. It's never about trying to build a world that is or could be self-sustaining. That is always going to be secondary to making sure that our character has what they need to get the job done and have all the resources they need. And we want to make sure that we're utilizing as much of the world as we can. If you have a race in there that has zero interaction with the main character, there's no point in even bringing them up. But you can always add influences. Like, you don't actually have to show the race, or you don't have to show how one person or how a group of people is going to be interacting, but rather you can show the effects, sort of like an echo. The effects of a race over in one portion of the world can have a lasting effect or have a significant impact on the main character and never actually have to show what the race actually looks like. Now, one of the ways that we can do this is by showing the effects like a ripple in the pond. What we're showing is how there's that chain reaction of what's going on in, say, a distant continent, depending on how we're using our systems. If we have a magic system, this is definitely going to be huge. But if you have like an old school boat, how does a uprising in an island where they manufacture cotton, how is that going to affect the rest of the world? Is that going to drive up the prices of local cotton? Is the revolt affecting food supplies, world food supplies? It would have to be pretty significant depending on how advanced your cultures are, but we can still allow outside non-visible characters or non-visible races to have an impact on our story. These are just ideas. This will help you formulate the ideas of how your main character is going to be going through their situation, going through their plot, and how they're going to be addressing all the problems and tribulations that they're going to be dealing with. So for us, is we need to make sure that we understand where the main character, the path that the main character has to take, and we can also add footholds or benchmarks or roadblocks or anything like that that will help us create a character that has a rich experience. And by having a main character specifically, that has a rich experience, that imparts into our reader a very rich experience for themselves. So let's get into it. So one of the things that I did is I took a look at our character sheets and actually went through and created one for a fantasy race. Now, I used the dwarves from Tolkien's world. A little bit different than from the Norse dwarves that was originally the inspiration for the dwarves. But because this is going to be a familiar race with a lot of people, I went with this because this gives us a good starting point and a benchmark to build off of. So the book genre is going to be fantasy, the race is dwarves. The name, now this is going to be their specific name. So one of the things that, if you take a look at world history, every nation has a different name for different other nation. For instance, German, we call it Germany, but they call it Deutschland. So they have a different way of talking about themselves. They have a different way of speaking. And what this is right here is Khazad, sort of like Khazad-dûm, which is the another name for Moria. So Khazad is the name for dwarves for themselves. Genders, how many genders do they have? We're not necessarily talking about any outside issues or anything else. We're talking what is going to be required for reproduction. That nothing else matters. This is what we're talking about, bare bones. Now, if you have multiple, that just remember, that's going to complicate things. And when you complicate things to a certain extent, this disconnects our reader from entering our world because they don't have those shared experiences. A shared experience that both the characters in your book and the reader have allows for a connection to be made up. Race, ethnicity, percentage. How much of the world have the dwarves occupied? Or if you summed up the entire total of population in this case, Middle Earth, what would their population percentage be? About 10%. Now, are we talking 10% in one location? Are we talking 10% scattered across the world? Why is there scattering? We'll go into a little bit of that later and why things are the way they are. Because if we know a lot about what the dwarves are and the type of environment that they prefer, it would give us a very clear understanding of why there's only 10%. Not to say that there is 10% in Tolkien's world, but this just gives us a number that we can kind of wrap our heads around. What their socioeconomic status, if we look at The Hobbit, they actually, because they were really good at craftsmanship and they had mithril and gold and silver mines, this allowed them to have a lot of money to the point where it actually caused conflict for the main characters or for the king of the Lonely Mountain. You know, their education high. If you're going to have high levels of craftsmanship, you're going to have higher education levels. In The Hobbit, they talk about how the Lonely Mountain would routinely have humans come and apprentice under master craftsmen from the dwarves. This means that in order for them to actually be able to talk about or train other people, they have to be pretty smart. Now, what's their parentage like? This goes back to how they were created. Now, if we're talking about a evolutionary tract, the parentage isn't as much of an issue. But what you could also say is if you have two sub-races come together. So you could say that parentage for the Europeans would be the Cro-Magnons and the Neanderthals or some other group. You know, this gives us an understanding of the genetic history of our characters. But because we understand the history of Middle Earth, we know that the dwarves were actually created by Aulule. Right? So if we have an understanding of where these people came about, this allows us to have different characters or have different impartations. Say, for instance, you have 4 races. Let's say humans, elves, dwarves, and orcs. Right? If we have those, each one could be created by their own god or own demigod. And this would allow for different variations in how they are portrayed and how they interact with the world for themselves. Because if we're going to have different races, they need to have their own, not only cultural differences, but also a more deeper, genetic differences beyond what they look like, how they interact with the world, what their focus is going to be. Things that are just a little bit beyond the culture, that quote, nature rather than nurture. So we want a good variation so that we have different factions that we can play off of each other to create a rich world. If you just have humans or you just have one single race, you could be very limited in the conflicts that you're going to be having. You're going to have something that's a little bit more closer to what we see today. Now, if you have other outside influences or outside races, this could give us a little bit more, especially if you're trying to tell something about your story. So when we're talking about goals here, we're talking about continuing the race, their genetic descendants. Most of the time, particularly when races are poor, they're going to want to make sure that they are continuing or having more offspring. And we'll go into this a little bit later, but what does that look like? How's their percentage? They say that replacement rate for humans, for every parent, for every husband and wife, they need to have 2 kids. So that is to maintain our levels of population. What does that look like for them? That dwarves live longer. We'll get into that a little bit later. Like I said earlier about how they impact the protagonist. Their goal of the story is not just to help flesh out the world, but also specifically how they are influencing the protagonist and how they're influencing the plot. How do they force the protagonist to grow? How does their influence in the world push or deter or do anything to our protagonist? These are going to be the primary aspects of what our race is going to be doing. Now, if you're talking about games, that's going to be a little bit different. A lot of tabletop games have different races, and that you can play with different races and whatnot. But if you're talking about a story specifically, they need to have a purpose. Everything has to have a purpose, and if it doesn't have a purpose, it doesn't need to be in there. And if something's different than what you would expect, or what's different from what our understanding is, you need to explain that. Biological realities. So for dwarves, they have a longer life than men. Now, obviously, they're not mortal like elves are, but they have a longer life, which means that they need to have a low birth rate. What are you going to do about what their birth rate's like? If you have a family, a husband and wife, and they both lived 500 years, are they only going to have 3 kids? 3 kids over a long period of time, especially if they're not dying, it means that you're going to have a larger population. Now, you're going to have a slower growth. You're going to have something that's a little bit more manageable if you have 3. But if their ability to have kids is wide, so they have 300 years of having babies, of being fertile, are they going to be having kids throughout that whole time? So if your age maturity, say for dwarves, is 50, which is 10%. So if the dwarves live to be about 500, 10%, that's pretty reasonable. So for 50 years, they could have 6 kids. And if every family has 6 kids, obviously this is depending on resources. But, if we want to make sure that we're not pushing ourselves, and 50 years is a lot of time for things to be developed. You can easily get food and whatnot pretty easily, especially if you're buying the food. You don't have to make it for yourself. High resistances to sickness. What does their worlds look like? What does the cities look like? Do they have good filtration systems? Do they have good ways of making sure that they're clean? It's not uncommon for third world countries for a lot of people to get sick because of uncleanliness. If you're not cleaning every day, if you're not making sure that you're getting rid of feces or fecal matter so that you're not going to get sick, or you're not going to be sharing sickness, what does their infant mortality rate looks like? These are all elements that we need to be keeping in mind for our races. What are they known for? They're sturdy. They have high endurance, crafting and mining. These are just basic elements that could play into how they are perceived. Now, even just the perception of how people are going to be looking like, that's going to change the impact on the story. So if you have, for instance, if you have a race that has the ability to fly, if they have wings, sort of like angels or seraphim or anything like that, they have the ability to fly. Where does that look like? What's the type of land that they're going to have? And does that mean that if they can fly, is your hero going to be walking past where they're at in their journey? Are they going to be trying to deal with those people? If this is a magicless world, how are the main characters going to deal with fighting against air superiority? Air superiority is one of those things that we need to make sure that we pay attention to, because that is the thing that can give us decisive victory in a battlefield. What do they represent? Going a little bit deeper about how our characters or how our race is going to be portrayed. For instance, orcs. They have a lot of kids, but they die early. Or are they representing something about human base nature and a more aggressive form of that base nature? Other things you need to keep in mind. Cultural linchpins. Are your races going to be homogenized centrally? Are they going to be in a specific area? Are they going to be doing things that are going to be bringing the culture together, or are they going to spread out like humans are? Are they going to be focused particular areas? These are all things that you need to be keeping in mind when you're talking about these races. A couple of weeks ago, we discussed the idea of map making. This is Inkarnate had a website, and they have a bunch of maps. This guy made it, and it's up on their website. I'm not going to be doing anything. I just want to help you understand some of these things that you're paying attention to. If you say you have 4 races, where are these people going to be going? Are you going to have each individual race be born in specific areas? If that's the case, where are they going to gravitate towards? Are they going to gravitate towards barren areas? Are they going to gravitate towards forests, mountain ranges? The Tolkien dwarves were famous for locating themselves mostly in ranges of mountains. So they're going to be in here. That's going to limit what they can do. Now, also something to keep in mind is if you have a specific race and they're going to be in a specific area, Does that specific area have the resources needed? So for instance, you might have an elven race. Elven races are typically going to, if we follow the stereotype, going to be in wooded areas. Now, over here, that would work. But over here, not so much, because you don't have any water. Remember what we discussed about having water sources for our characters. Now, there are stories of different races, so elves were known for having mines in some stories, making sure that we're also paying attention to more adverse climates. The more extremes, the top and bottom, the north and south that we go, the harder it is going to be to raise specific types of crops. Unless you have a specific crop that is designed for that specific area, it's not going to survive. And we'll get into that one a little bit later. So the easier it is, the more tropical this is going to be. The more in the center of the world is going to be more tropic. So having different types of foods in different areas or different climates are going to play a part in it. These are all things that you need to be doing to keep in mind about how you're going to be setting up your world. These are foundational elements. And I focus more specifically on multiple races, having multiple races and how they're going to be interacting. But if you just remove the races and just have multiple people, for instance, if you just had humans here, now you're going to have growth. They're going to eventually slowly move over, and chances are, given how this map is laid out, you're going to have movement along here slowly across all the way around. This right here is a bit of a barrier. They're not going to be able to go too far up north because the resources are going to be scarcer up there. Yes, you're going to be able to hunt and do hunter-gatherer stuff up here, but it's going to be harder with the lower levels of specialization. Higher levels of specialization allow for things like pelts and things like that to be fashioned easily, whereas areas that have lower survivable requirements, water, food, or warmer environments, these are the things that allow our characters or allow our races to survive longer with less issue. The problem is that, as we see even to today, in more tropic climates, we see that they haven't progressed. So there is an element of hardship forcing a culture to grow. If there's no reason for a specialization to be invented, it's not going to be invented. Necessity is the mother of all invention. So keep that in mind whenever you're telling your story, is how your characters or how your races are going to be interacting with each other first, but also how they're going to be moving about the world. So for instance, by the time they get over here, once this race gets over here, the hunter-gatherers, if they're down here, they're more in a tropical area where they don't need resources. They are literally just similar to what we saw with Native Americans. Depending on how long this takes and depending on how long everything goes on here, you can have a warlike groups really, developing and fighting over here. But the technology advances to the point where they can actually sail across here. This is what we kind of saw with Native Americans and the Europeans coming across. Depending on how big this world is, we can see very significant cultural differences in how things are played out. For instance, if you have longer living races, they could come up with a lot of technologies earlier on and play a part over here. So if you have races that live to be 1,000 years old over here, and eventually there's still hunter-gatherers over here, yes, you might have a lot more people spread out, but depending on what's going on, you can literally have so many people with so much technology developed that they are able to move over and start conquering other lands. All right, everybody, that's all I had for today. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, let me know in the comments. As always, I will put all this information that I use in the description below. Until next time, bye. I am a poor, wayfaring stranger. I'm traveling through this world of woe. Yet there's no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright land to which I go.